If we think about somebody's personality as falling somewhere along a set of continuous dimensions, how can we tell where a given person falls along each of the dimensions? For example, how could you tell how a particular one of your friends falls along the dimension of conscientiousness? This is a question that's been the focus of a great deal of research. A complex trait like conscientiousness is not the result of a single gene or a single brain area. It's not the result of a single part of your conceptual network or some individual cognitive process. So we can't tell how conscientious your friend is by taking a DNA sample, by measuring the levels of protein in her blood, by measuring the size or activation level of a specific area, or by measuring implicit priming. We could ask her how conscientious she is on a scale of 1 to 10, but her report would depend on how she interpreted the scale and by the social desirability of being seen as conscientious. We could ask you how conscientious she is, but you've only seen her in a limited set of circumstances, and you might also be biased. We could look at how much she studies, but that would be influenced by how motivated she is and not just by how conscientious she is. There's no single question you can ask, and no single behavior or aspect of biology you can measure to determine how conscientious someone is. Conscientiousness is a complex trait that reflects many individual internal mental processes and combines in complex ways with other traits and external social and environmental factors to determine how somebody behaves in a particular situation. As a result, assessing someone's personality is like being a detective. Just as a detective combines many clues to reconstruct what happened in a crime, a personality psychologist combines many clues to assess an individual's personality. In a later lecture, we'll discuss how personality psychologists combine clues from a person's self-reports, reports of other people, measures of overt behavior, and measures of long-term outcomes like cardiovascular disease. But for now, I want to focus on the general issue of how different clues can be combined together to assess a personality trait. To do this, I'll focus on the simplest and most widely used approach to assessing personality, namely personality questionnaires. You've probably taken online quizzes that purport to tell you about your IQ, your personality, or some habit of yours. Personality questionnaires are a little bit like this. In fact, there are many personality tests that you can find online that are based on real tests that personality psychologists use. Here are the kinds of statements you might get on a personality test. For each statement, you would write down a number between 1 and 5 to indicate how well it applies to you, with 1 meaning not at all and 5 meaning a lot. A full questionnaire would have hundreds of statements like these. Pause the video for a minute, read through these 10 statements, and think about how you would respond about yourself for each of them. One thing that you'll notice is that the statements are about your thoughts and behaviors and don't directly ask about your personality. They don't ask how conscientious or extroverted you are. Instead, they ask about behaviors like getting chores done and mental states like how comfortable you feel around other people. You might notice that statement number 4, I am always prepared, and statement number 7, I get chores done right away, are both related to the same concept of conscientiousness. If you give yourself a high score on number 4, you'll probably also give yourself a high score on number 7. However, they're not exactly the same statement. And some people might say they're a 5 in terms of being prepared, but only a 4 in terms of getting chores done right away. And other people might say the opposite. There are also statements that get at extroversion, like statement number 1, I feel comfortable around other people. Number 5, I don't talk a lot, is also related to extroversion, but someone who is extroverted would give a low score to this rather than a high score. That is, it's a reversed question. Most personality questionnaires have some statements where a high score means that you're high along the dimension, and other statements where a high score means you're low along the dimension. How do researchers know what kinds of statements to put on a personality questionnaire? And how do they know that statement number 2 and statement number 8 are related to the same dimension of personality, openness to experience? The statements on a questionnaire like this are usually based on a combination of theory and data. Theories are used to generate statements that are likely to reflect personality traits, and then data from hundreds or thousands of people who have taken the questionnaire are then used to validate the statements. For example, imagine that a group of researchers started with the 11 statements shown here and gave the questionnaire to 1,000 people. They'd probably find that scores on statements 4 and 7 are correlated with each other. That is, people who score high on one usually score high on the other, and people who score low on one usually score low on the other. This means that these two statements reflect the same aspect of personality. The researchers would probably also find that scores on statements 2 and 8 are correlated with each other. This means that these two statements also reflect some common aspect of personality. However, the researchers would probably also find that statements 2 and 8 are not correlated with statements 4 and 7. The finding that 2 and 8 are correlated with each other, and 4 and 7 are correlated with each other, but 2 and 8 are not correlated with 4 and 7, mean that 2 and 8 reflect one dimension of personality, whereas 4 and 7 reflect some other dimension of personality. The researchers might also find that statement number 11, I like chocolate ice cream, isn't correlated with any of the other statements. This would mean that number 11 just isn't a useful statement for assessing personality, and it would get dropped from the questionnaire. This is the general approach that researchers use to figure out what statements or questions to include in a personality questionnaire. However, they don't just look at individual pairs of correlations. They use a much more sophisticated statistical approach called factor analysis that looks at the entire pattern of correlations across all of the questions. The factor analysis calculates how strongly each statement is related to a given personality dimension. For example, some people who are pretty introverted may still talk a lot when they're in small groups, so statement 5 might not be as strongly related to extroversion as statement 1 is. The factor analysis provides a weighting for each statement, and this makes it possible to provide a precise quantitative estimate of exactly where someone falls along a dimension such as extroversion or conscientiousness. The next step is to determine exactly what aspect of personality a cluster of correlated statements represents. Sometimes this is pretty obvious from the statements. However, what researchers really like to show is that a person's score along a given dimension is correlated with some aspect of behavior. For example, if we see that people who score high on statements 2 and 8 have traveled to a lot more cities than people who score low on these statements, that they've tried a lot more different kinds of foods, that they've taken a broader range of courses in college, and that it's more likely that they've moved to a different state, then this will support the idea that the underlying personality dimension can be well described as openness to experience. We began with the idea that personality assessment is like detective work. We assemble many pieces of evidence to reconstruct someone's personality. In a personality questionnaire, we can think of the rating someone gives on a given statement as being a clue to their personality. And we can use the pattern of ratings across all of the statements as a big set of clues to the person's personality. We might also look at how other people rate the person on the same set of statements. This would give us even more clues. And we might look at how the person behaves in the laboratory or in the real world to give us even more clues.